Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Truth Seeker here, and I'm comfortably indoors. As I mentioned in my past video, I recently came back from vacation about a week ago, and now it's 46 degrees and blowing like it's got to be 30-mile-an-hour steady winds out there. So that's why I'm not outside enjoying the weather. I'm pretty much forced indoors. I haven't much time today. I have a work commitment, believe it or not, on Sunday. I have to be at a location by 8 o'clock this evening, 8:30, sometime around there. And that doesn't give me a whole lot of time. But I thought that I'd talk about a couple of things. There was a video on the Bible Students channel. The Bible Students have a YouTube channel where they post the talks that were given at the General Convention. And also, I believe they have a similar site for the International Convention, which was held this past August. In the beginning of August. My cousin was one of the featured speakers at this international convention. The international convention is held biannually, and it's more heavily attended than the generally speaking, than the Bible Students General Convention. Mainly because of the Eastern European contingency. It turned out that when the Iron Curtain fell, there were many more Bible students in the Eastern Bloc nations than anybody had supposed, which was an interesting thing. They held on to Charles Taze Russell's beliefs, and were Bible students in every sense of the word, and very few of these had been known of until the late 1980s, when access to the Eastern European nations was more or less, let's say, freer access, freer communication between the two worlds, the Western European world and the Eastern European world. Up to that point, there were Bible students in Europe, in Britain, in Great Britain, in Germany, in France, a few were in Italy, that were known and in regular communication with Bible students here in the United States, in particular the Dawn. But it wasn't until the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, that a large number, relatively speaking, a large number of Bible students became known from the European nations. And when you hear Lloyd Evans talk about his friend that actually introduced him to his wife, his friend actually defected from the Jehovah's Witnesses and joined the Bible Students, and apparently his friend, he's mentioned his friend's name before, Miroslav, is I believe he may be Romanian, I don't know, but he's from Eastern Europe, and maybe it was Croatia. Anyway, Miroslav did introduce Lloyd to his wife, Deanna. And And it's interesting that Miroslav joined the Bible students, because the Bible students, though that was part of that contingency of Bible students that we here in the U.S., sort of the heartland, the homeland of the Bible student sect, founded by Charles Taze Russell. This was sort of viewed as sort of the center of Bible student activity, and it turns out that there are many more in Eastern Europe. If you go to YouTube and do a search on Bible students, the Bible Students channel, you'll find it, and you may be able to find the International Convention and some of the talks that were given there. Every so often they do a pan into the crowd, and you can see that it's quite a large convention for a Bible Students convention. I mean, today, if you look at the Bible Students General Convention, and every year there's a photograph, it's a tradition of Bible students going back into the earliest days of the Bible students with Charles Taze Russell to take convention photographs. And Bible students do that today. They've always done that, and the Bible students convention photographs today. I don't count them head by head, but I do a bit of a kind of an estimating. And I would say that in the photograph you'll find maybe 400 or so Bible students represented there. That's the majority of the convention. The interesting thing is that by the end of the week, the general convention held here in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, in the United States, over the last 20 years, has been decreasing in number and size, and you'll find that there are probably more attending the convention online at the end of the week, because they are week-long and have historically been week-long conventions since 1938. Chautauqua is traditionally thought of as the general convention that kicked it all off. There were it was a week-long convention there, Chautauqua, I believe, Ohio, and the numbers always tailed off toward the end of the week. It was the heaviest attendance for general conventions was always the weekend that kicked it off. It always started on a Friday evening. Saturday was the first day of the convention, and Sunday. Those were the two most heavily attended days, and then Bible students gradually, the convention numbers thinned out until Thursday, when there would be substantially fewer Bible students at the general convention, but not like today, where you look at the numbers in attendance. If they pan the audience, it looks mostly empty. In fact, one of the speakers this year commented on it, and I think he was a little put off that there was nobody there for his talk. He, of course, had to correct himself, because you can't be upset that as a Bible student, it's wrong for you to be upset that something's askew, that something affects you personally, and that you took offense to it. So he corrected himself pretty quickly after that and tried to turn it into a joke, but you could see that he wasn't happy that he was not speaking to a very large audience. In fact, there probably were over 100 attending online and viewing the convention online than there were in the audience. There were probably 50 or even less in the audience at that time. So that's the trend of the Bible students these days. It's diminishing. It's fading away here, especially in the U.S. In Europe, and especially Eastern Europe, there's a little stronger, I guess, membership than here, probably anywhere in the world, and they kind of carry on the Bible student tradition. In fact, if you look at the International Convention program, it almost looks like a throwback to the old Bible student programs from Charles Russell's day. Just the art style and the way they put it together just reminded me of the earliest Bible student, the way they put things together, in their literature, their artistic way of doing things. But anyway, there's been a lot online, a lot of discussion, a lot of activity going on with regard to Watchtower and the problems that the Watchtower is facing these days. And I've already made a video that I made some comments regarding the sex abuse scandals regarding the Watchtower. I do believe that Watchtower is shooting off their own foot. If they were serious about reform, this is the time to do it. And Jeffrey Jackson, I can remember when he was facing the Royal Commission, just bold-faced lied to the Justice McClellan, who questioned him directly about their policies and how they have fallen. That these policies put them in a position where individuals are not safe within the Jehovah's Witnesses organizations, because the policies protect pedophiles. Angus Stewart did a marvelous job of bringing that point out, and Justice McClellan, it was almost as if he couldn't believe his ears about what he was hearing, and basically Jackson played dumb and gave him answers that he knew that he would want to hear. That I would take these recommendations back, and I'm not the only one. We've got a governing body, and I'm just one of the governing body. And he even tried to evade any responsibility at all. But McClellan pointed out very poignantly that Jackson is one of the 7 leaders or 8 leaders of the Jehovah's Witnesses that really set policy. And when Jackson couldn't squirm out of that one, he started making these empty promises about bringing back these recommendations to make changes and to have women take more of a role in the judicial end of things, and to change this 2-witness policy. And Jackson just lied the Royal Commission, he had no intention of changing. These guys just will not reform. They will not change, and they're paying the price for it. There's no question about it that they're paying the price for their lack of concern, really, lack of empathy, lack of concern for their laity, and it's resulting in heavy fines, and they deserve it. And it may bring them out, it may just bring them down. I mean, for once we've got some idea of the financial condition of the Watchtower as a result of these latest Montana trial, and the Watchtower had been found guilty of breaking Montana code, and as a result, the jury had to go back and reassess an award for punishment in this case as a result of their breaking law, and so what had been a win for the plaintiff. They were asking for $2 million. The jury granted $4 million to the individual. That's twice the amount. And then when they were charged to go back and reconsider the other penalty that they had to assess, it was based on an amount of money that the financial condition the financial condition of the Watchtower was a consideration that had to be taken into account when they assessed this penalty against Watchtower. And so for the very first time, Watchtower gave some kind of value, and it was over $1 billion in assets. Now, when I personally, as a part of my job, I have to look at the finances of large corporations, and I have to do an analysis of whether or not they are financially solvent, whether they have any potential for going bankrupt, and it requires when you take a look at when you do a financial analysis, and I don't have an MBA, I'm an engineer. I don't have background in finance, but just because my job requires me to do a financial analysis, I've learned on the job how to take a look at a large corporation's finances, their reports, their let's say SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission reports that they file annually. They call them 10K filings, which are to disclose, which are annual filings that require publicly owned companies to disclose their finances to potential investors. And for publicly owned companies that are based outside of the U.S., it's called the 20F form, but it's the same sort of thing. And there must be 23 or 24 different indices that we look at, like debt to assets to debt ratio. Let's see, I forget the name of it. One of the things that I end up calculating is what they call the Altman Z-score, which is it takes into account things called total assets and current assets, total liabilities, current liabilities. And there are formulas that estimate, and this Altman Z-score is a predictor of whether or not the company is heading towards bankruptcy. And that's key for us in understanding their financial condition. If they're going to go bankrupt, we're not going to want to do business with them. So we calculate all of these different financial indices to get an understanding of a company's cash assets, to look at their long-term liabilities, to take a look at their ability to raise debt, let's say to have credit, to raise cash through credit, and all of these things come into play when you look at the health of a corporation. Now, in the Montana trial, only I think the net worth of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of New York and Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses were given, and it's not clear exactly what was entailed in that. I believe it was their cash value as well as assets that belong to these two corporations. Of course, Watchtower, as I mentioned before, is a complicated company like most corporations, and they have many different divisions, and these assets are split up among the different divisions. And so when they give the assets of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of New York, it's not reflective of Watchtower's total financial condition altogether. So it still doesn't give us a full and complete understanding of how Watchtower is, financially, and how their wealth is distributed in assets and in cash and so on. We need a full financial disclosure from Watchtower to be able to get a better idea of that, and Watchtower hasn't given that kind of information. They have it, I'm sure. They do have accountants that do a complete financial analysis, looking at the revenues and their assets and how they're doing. And that's why they've been asking for money, because they're not getting enough revenue for them to continue business. They've had to cut back quite a bit, and they're publishing, and so their operational end of things, they've had to try and save expenditures as much as possible, because they're not able to raise enough money to sustain the business, and that's really what they are, is a business, and so they've taken on these measures and also made these pleas to increase donations so that they can balance out the ledgers a little better. So unfortunately, we don't have a full financial understanding of Watchtower, but we've got enough to know that they are in trouble. But while all of these different things that have been happening to Watchtower, and it deservedly so. I mean, they're adamant about not changing their policies. It could really be the financial end of Watchtower, and they may end up going bankrupt someday because they now have to pay out these judgments, these legal judgments. And trust me, legal fees are not cheap. They're spending more on lawyers than they are, and believe me, they're hiring outside counsel. Their in-house counsel is not cutting it, and they got so many of these cases. If that list of that they refused to turn over in the Louis Lopez trial is really 21,000 actual cases. 21 times $10 million a case, 21,000 times $10 million a case is a heck of a lot more money than Watchtower's got. I don't even think the Catholic Church could even sustain those types of penalties. And right now, Watchtower has been averaging close to $10 million a case at a minimum. I mean, the Conti case was originally $27 million, and they got knocked down to about $5 million. It's substantially less. Louis Lopez was about $13 million because Watchtower defaulted in that case. And they've also got a contempt of court in that case where they're paying $2,000 a day. Right now they've got over $2 million in liabilities in that contempt of court fine. They got a $66 million case, class action suit in Canada that they're facing. And they just lost $35 million in this Montana case to a single trial. So they're really at that rate. They certainly can't sustain 21,000 lawsuits. And how many cases have they settled out of court? We don't know. They're not going to disclose that kind of information. But their record for winning trials is not good, and so it's in their interest to settle rather than go to trial. And when they do go to trial, they lose big, and they lose big time. So you could imagine that the lawyers that are involved in making these settlements know this, and that these settlements are substantial. They're not small, because the likelihood is Watchtower is going to lose the case. And it's because of their attitude. Their total lack of empathy for the peoples, the individuals that have been hurt, and their adamant and cold attitude about people in general. I mean, their policy for shunning is horrific, and it destroys families. And there have been a lot of interesting videos lately, and one of them brought to mind, and I can't remember exactly what it was that brought it to my mind, but I've always enjoyed looking back at Watchtower's history. I mean, Jehovah's Witnesses are a line that kind of branched off. You know, you want to talk about evolutionary tree, what are they, phylogeny, whatever it is, where the evolutionary branches, the evolutionary tree. Jehovah's Witnesses branched off from the Bible student movement. They maintained control of the Watchtower Society, but they were not the original sect associated with the Watchtower. The Bible students were. But the Bible students, they lost control of the Watchtower and went their separate way, and continue to this day to follow Charles Russell's works, his writings, his teachings. And so Charles Taze Russell is still basically the leader of the Bible students. I made a series recently, this past summer, Who Are the Bible Students, sort of to give an idea of the history of the Bible students and how things came to be to the conditions that we see today of the two sects, where Watchtower went off and formed the Jehovah's Witnesses, and then how the Bible students regrouped and began to meet independently from the Watchtower's control. And I made quite a number of videos because it's a very complex, it was a lurid history, especially when it got to Judge Rutherford. But it's interesting. I know I talked about Nelson Barber in the past and Russell's association. That was a very important connection. It was interesting when I went to the Watchtower headquarters and to their museum there that outlines their history. They're proud of their history, but they present their history from a very biased point of view, and they only present what they want their members to see. There's a lot of their history that they omit, and Barber was one of them. In the entrance, as you move into the different exhibits for the museum, where they show the full photodrama and Russell's cape and cane, gold knobbed cane, and his top hat, and they have a big blue field cloth chart of the ages, which is something that many Jehovah's Witnesses would not be familiar with, but it was sort of the mainstay of Bible students from the inception of the Watchtower to the present time. The Bible students use the chart of the ages as a sort of a graphical backdrop to the overall plan of God and God's plan of salvation. So they have one of these hanging on the wall. Then they've got all of Rutherford's writings. They call them the Rutherford Rainbow because of the bright colors in the books. The covers of the books were all brightly colored, and they had the photographs that were brought door to door because they didn't trust the laity to say the right thing at the door, so they basically just knocked on your door, plopped out a record on a portable record player. They called Aaron because it spoke for the person who was doing the witness, and it was usually one of Rutherford's discourses, probably that religion is a snare and a racket, and that basic message that he was giving. He was particularly bitter against contemporary Christian religions. And they were merciless against Rutherford, and should be. You can understand he kind of brought it. You don't stand out in a lightning storm with a 10-foot metal rod, okay? And that's basically what Rutherford did. He drew the angst and the anger, wrath of contemporary Christendom upon himself by his raucous and sharp criticisms that he made against the contemporary Christians. But one person, and I was thinking about this the other day, and I made a comment on one of the channels, and I can't remember why, but it brought to mind a person that I didn't mention, and you don't hear mentioned much, who was. What I had mentioned was what I was getting at was at the entrance of this exhibit in the Watchtower Museum. They have Russell and Russell's influences. George Storrs. They had a photograph of George Storrs and or an illustration of George Storrs based on a photograph. George Stetton, Henry Grew, and others that Watchtower claimed were influences. I believe William Miller may have been involved in this. That had an influence on Russell, and there were many individuals that played into Russell's getting into the religion business. Jonas Welling, one person though that is often omitted, and he was there right at the very beginning. He was actually an associate of Nelson Barber. Now, Barber was missing from this list of people influential to Russell. Watchtower doesn't want their members to know about Barber, and so Barber was omitted. And he played an important role in Russell. Russell really bought into chronology as a result of Barber and numerical prophecies, and how these prophecies were being fulfilled, and that that these prophecies could foretell when Jesus' presence, when he was going to come again, which was 1874. And when the end of the world would be, which was 1914. And Barber really was the one that brought Russell into and convinced Russell that there was something to the biblical chronology. So Barber played a huge role in Russell's beliefs. And associated with Barber at the time when Barber and Russell met was John Paton. Now, John Paton first was associated with Barber, but when Barber and Russell had a falling out on the doctrine of the ransom, Barber didn't believe that Jesus coming down as a man and making a sacrifice was a substitutionary justice, offsetting with the way Watchtower currently teaches that Jesus, as a perfect man, paid the price of Adam's sin. So a perfect man for a perfect man balanced the scales of justice and thereby redeems humanity. And that was something that Russell felt strongly about, even though Russell believed Adam and Eve would benefit from this ransom sacrifice of Jesus, and that they would be resurrected. Later, Rutherford made the claim that they were not beneficiaries of the ransom sacrifice and therefore not redeemed. And so, according to Rutherford, in 1937, Adam and Eve would not be resurrected, and that's the current teachings of the Watchtower today. The ransom continues to be a cornerstone doctrine of the Watchtower and of the Bible students. It may be in the Bible students sect the foundation doctrine that Bible students hold to, and actually consider you, whether or not you're a brother or not in their faith, is if you hold on to the doctrine of the ransom. Again, the ransom is that Jesus gave up his pre-human existence, became a perfect man, and sacrificed his life as a substitute for Adam's transgression. Adam was told that if he disobeyed God, that he would pay the penalty, the price would be death. And so Jesus offered his life instead for Adam, in place of Adam, and God accepted that arrangement, and therefore that released Adam from the penalty of death, and therefore humanity and all those that were born into sin. Sin was an inherited sort of thing from Adam on down, Adam and Eve on down. Humanity then was redeemed or freed from that penalty, and thus was entitled to a resurrection. And this resurrection would occur in the 1,000-year kingdom. And the 1,000-year kingdom was going to be ruled by Jesus, who was established as the king. And this kingdom, according to the chronology that Russell derived from Nelson Barber, began in 1914 in heaven. And so Jesus is now the king, and will rule when the mediatorial reign of Christ begins on earth in the 1,000-year kingdom. And so that's when humanity will gain a resurrection as a result of the benefit of the ransom, and then having been freed from the penalty of death that they inherited through Adam's transgression. So that is basically the cornerstone of the faith of Russell and of the Bible students, and still of the Jehovah's Witnesses, with some caveats. The caveat being Adam and Eve will not be resurrected. So this brought to mind, for some reason, I was thinking about Paton as a result of some of the things that have been said. And John Paton was a very early associate of Nelson Barber. And when Barber and Russell broke in 1879, Russell began his own paper called Zion's Watchtower, and that was the beginning of the Watchtower magazine. And John Paton continued to associate with Russell. He broke ranks with Barber and stayed with Russell. He was one of the earliest supporters of Russell and was a very influential Bible student, very early Bible student in the formative days, when there were the very first of the classes in the Northeast United States, in Pennsylvania, centered in Allegheny, where the Watchtower was originated, in Allegheny, the Bible House, and there were Bible student ecclesias that were popping up throughout the Northeast, in New York, Michigan, Ohio, through that sort of northeastern quadrant of the U.S. And there were 30 Bible student classes, and that's how Russell became Pastor Russell, because they all elected Russell to be their composite pastor, and he would travel between each of these congregations, or they called them ecclesias at the time. And he and Paton were very, very instrumental in keeping this fellowship kind of grouped together. They did eventually begin to arrange conventions where all of these different members from these different classes could meet each other and associate and fellowship. And they began the Bible student culture. But Paton was a very well-known person, and he was very instrumental in providing the glue between these disparate ecclesias. And Russell provided him with the financial. And initially, most of this work was supported by Russell's personal finances, and he was, not a millionaire by any means, but he was independently wealthy. And I believe when he sold his haberdashery business, there were 5 stores, I think he claimed, that he sold for about $350,000, which if you do the conversion today, it's equivalent to it's a little under $10 million, something like $6.5 or $7 million, something like that, with the rate of inflation taken into account. So there was a substantial amount of money. It wasn't a bottomless well of wealth, but it was enough to fund what was necessary in beginning this new religious sect that they were forming in those days. And Russell supported Paton very strongly. But eventually, Paton began to drift, and he kind of faded out of the scene. And it was interesting because, where did he go? What happened to him? And I did a little research on Paton, and I'm wondering, I'm beginning. First off, one of the interesting things that I found out about Paton, there are some biographies online about him. One of the first things that I learned was that he fought for the Union. I forget it. I believe it was from Michigan, because each state provided militias, different regiments and so on. They were state regiments. They were raised by the state. So New York had an army, and Michigan had an army, Indiana had an army, and they all were part of the Union Army, but they all were segmented by the various states. And I think Paton fought for some militia that was originated in Michigan, but I found out that he had been at Chickamauga, the Battle of Chickamauga, and actually had been injured there. He was a casualty at Chickamauga. Chickamauga, if you know anything about Civil War history, was one of the most fiercely fought battles. It was an awful battle. And technically speaking, the South was considered to have won that battle, but it was really more or less a draw. And it was awful fighting in deep woods. There was a lot of disorganization, and a lot of people were killed and maimed in Chickamauga, and it was an awful battle. And Paton was there. Now, these battles back in those days really were hand-to-hand combat, and they were far more terrifying than the battle. Well, I don't know. I can't necessarily say that. I've never been in battle or a war. But I can imagine the fact that they were far more personal in those days, that you actually would see the person that you killed, that you sometimes had to stab them with a bayonet. because you couldn't load your gun fast enough to shoot them, your rifle. That was making things pretty personal, and they didn't know anything about the mental effects. In World War II they called it shell shock. They didn't know what shell shock was, and in fact, another Paton, General George Paton, got in real big trouble by slapping a soldier who actually was in shell shock, and he wasn't missing an arm or a leg, and he didn't have any apparent physical injury, but his mental state was in dire straits, and he couldn't fight. And Paton saw this man and wondered why he wasn't out there fighting with the rest of them, and he called him a coward. And Paton really took a hard publicity over that one. But that was a different Paton, and I think there are 2 T's in his name. John Paton, he spelled his name Paton, and but having been injured at Chickamauga, I wonder if his mental state wasn't such that he had turned to religion because somehow the war affected him. They didn't understand about PTSD as we do today. So I wonder if that didn't come into play, and also come into play with some of Paton's volatility, in a sense. When I mean volatile, I mean variable. First, he associated very strongly with Nelson Barber, but then he abandons Barber for Russell, and then later he abandons Russell. And so he wasn't one that really stayed with my lovely wife, didn't stay with any one particular set of beliefs. Eventually, I understand that he adopted an understanding of evolution and wrote books about it. And this really got under Russell's skin, and he wrote an article in 1894 called Harvest Siftings, and in there he spends a lot of time talking about John Paton. And I think his main concern was because of the fact that he supported Paton, that Paton was such a high profile in the early Bible students movement, that he was afraid that Paton could influence Bible students, especially those who were not as founded, and that they were babes in the truth, and that they only had the milk of the word. They couldn't have strong meat, as Paul says in Hebrews, or at least what Russell thought Paul said. There's some contention as to whether or not Paul actually wrote Hebrews. The consensus among experts is that Paul was not the author of the book of Hebrews. But anyway, Russell in this article had some strong words about Paton and his adoption of the theory of evolution. And I'm going to see if I can find that statement this is interesting. In the here he says that this is why he was so concerned. He says, the little history of the way in which Mr. Paton came to terms. See, notice here, instead of Brother Paton, he calls him Mr. Paton here in this article. At one time, he was Brother Paton. And Russell had some, if you do a little research on the idea of disfellowshipping, he was pretty strong on his position in cutting off association with anybody who was didn't adopt the truth. And so Paton here is no longer Brother Paton. And the little history of the way in which Mr. Paton came to turn from us and from the ransom to oppose that which he once clearly saw and advocated is important, as it became the occasion of another sifting. This is when people left the truth, they were being sifted. Rutherford adopted this whole thing when the four directors were ousted from, when Rutherford ousted the four directors when he became president. They wrote pamphlets to Bible students and distributed them throughout the movement. And Rutherford responded with a paper called Harvest Siftings. And he continued this idea that there was a sifting, that this was an idea that Russell himself began. And so it says that it came to turn from us and from the ransom to oppose that which he once clearly saw and advocated is important, as it became the occasion of another sifting or testing of the Watchtower readers, by the time a much larger number, because Mr. Paton had been a respected brother and co-worker with us, and because as a traveling representative of the Tower and its doctrines, his expenses being met in part by Tower subscriptions and renewals, as well as by the money from me, he was personally known to a large number of the readers than was the editor of the Tower. Who was the editor of the Tower? Charles Taze Russell. He was really concerned. And it came about thus. In the year 1881, Mr. Barber, still publishing the Herald and endeavoring to overthrow the doctrine of the ransom, finding that on preaching tour I had used a diagram of the tabernacle to illustrate Christ's sacrifice typified in the sacrifices of typical Israel, and so on. He's arguing here. But it turns out that one of the things here that Paton had adopted, I think this is, yes, right here. Mr. Paton, who is now also an advocate of that other gospel, okay? And this is something that Christians, even today, oppose those who espouse evolution as a religion. Atheism is, to them, they try to pass it off as another religion. Evolution, they try to pass off as another religion. And this happened very early on, and this is what Russell is doing here. And he says, Mr. Paton, who is also now an advocate of that other gospel, of which the cross of Christ is not the center, and denies that which he bought us with his own precious blood, Mr. P. has since published another book, which, though called by the same name as the one we introduced, being on another and a false foundation, I cannot and do not recommend, but I esteem misleading sophistry, tending to undermine the whole structure of the Christian system, yet retaining the sufficiency of truths which we once held common, to make it palatable and dangerous to all not rooted and grounded upon the ransom rock. The false foundation which it presents is the old heathen doctrine of evolution, revamped, and not only denies the fall of men, but as a consequence, all necessity for a redeemer. It claims, on the contrary, that not by redemption and restitution to a lost estate, but by progressive evolution or development, man has risen and is still to rise from the lower condition in which he was created, until by his own good works he ultimately reaches a divine nature. So this is Russell's interpretation of that of evolution, that humankind has advanced. And that was the idea back then. This was 1894. They didn't understand about the genetics. They didn't understand fully all of the mechanics of evolution, but the teachings and understanding of evolution by natural selection being a gradual process, a gradual change leading to speciation over great periods of time, can lead to vastly different creatures that can no longer, they have a common ancestry, but can no longer interbreed with one another and have completely different physical features and characteristics and so on. And this is still something that modern Christians today fight against very, very strongly, because many Christians are fundamentalists that believe in the 7 days, literal 7 days of creation, and that evolution destroys this idea of the creative process in a literal sense, literal 7 24-hour days. But Russell here saw a different problem with evolution, is that it denies the fact that there was an Adam. If there was no Adam, then who did Jesus die for? And that there can't be a ransom. It destroyed the whole foundation of Russell's complete doctrine. The foundation of his entire teaching was destroyed when evolution was presented. The evolution of humankind was the origin of the species, and the descent of man was published by Darwin. And today we know, and I'm not even going to begin to argue why evolution is true. It is true. There are good books on this subject. Jerry Coyne has a noted biologist from University of Chicago, has a book out recently, within the last several years, for the layman, called "Why Evolution is True." The author again is Jerry Coyne. He's got, I've seen him interviewed on a number of YouTube channels, and the book is excellent for the layperson like me. I'm not a biologist, but it is a my wife is getting silly here. I've got to cut this short, but I know that I'm not going to argue the dating, radiometric dating, the science of it. The arguments against radiological dating, carbon-14 is well established. Physics doesn't change. Physics doesn't change. Physics is the same. It's the same in the past as it is today, and And when materials decay, they decay according to the decay constant. We call it a constant because it is indeed constant. It doesn't change. It's not variable. And we know that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. We know from the different decay rates of different materials, isotopic materials, that different rock layers are of a different age, and we can use this science to our advantage to understand when things lived, when certain fossils existed, when certain animals existed, when humans existed. Carbon dating can only be used for the last, it's tens of thousands of years. Some say 50,000, but you can use it for materials that are in, I think, up to about 100,000 years. You can still use carbon dating. I think the circumstances vary, but it's in the tens of thousands of years, and it's highly accurate. And we use the carbon dating regularly. And the irony is that Christians often will accept carbon dating when it supports their point of view, but reject it outright when it denies their points of view. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. But I'm not going to go into any kind of a science lesson on first order decay rates or anything like that. That's something that you can research yourself. I'm not going to argue the validity of dating, the validity of evolution. I mean, we see evolution happening today with microbes, and the current concern there is with antibiotics. We have strains of bacteria that infectious disease and infectious bacteria, like MRSA, that are resistant to antibiotics, and that's a major concern because antibiotics have revolutionized our lives. One of the most common killers were I think of Carnegie. All of the millions of dollars that Thomas Carnegie, the brother of Andrew Carnegie, had, and he owned Cumberland Island, and built a 54-room mansion there, and that was his retirement home. They had tremendous amounts of money, but he lived in the 1880s and got stuck by a wild orange. Now, a wild orange, if you've never seen one, they have these giant thorns, and they're very, very sharp. And he got pricked by one of these, and he got an infection and in a wet septic on him, and he died very quickly. He never even saw the benefit of his house retirement. He died within weeks of being pricked of this wild orange thorn, and not all the millions of dollars that he had could save his life. And we could return to a situation like that today with bacteria that are now becoming resistant to antibiotics, because bacterial generations are so much shorter that many thousands, if not millions of generations have transpired since the 1940s, when antibiotics and penicillin came into being, that these bugs now have adapted to the antibiotics and now thrive in the presence of these things, despite being given antibiotics to kill these infectious microbes. So we see evolution happening today. Humans and whales are among the fastest evolving creatures in the natural world today. I mean, Australopithecus 4 million years ago was you could call it the missing link, was more chimp-like than human, and yet it's in the hominid line, and whales have evolved in a very rapid form from originally a hippo-like creature. They're very closely genetically related to hippos, and adapted to life completely in the sea. In a relatively short period, tens of millions of years. So evolution can occur relatively quickly, and I'm not going to try and argue why it's true. There are better sites that you can find that explain the evolution process. Aaron Ra, I recommend. He's doing the phylogeny project, which talks about the basis of evolution and how it works. And there are some excellent websites that you can go to that discuss evolution. But evolution, rightly so, as Russell recognized readily. Just the idea that humankind, modern humans, existed 100,000 years ago destroys Russell's understanding of the ransom and restitution, and evolution destroys the idea of Jesus offering his life as a substitution for the founding father of all of humanity. So that and I think that the evidence for evolution is beyond doubt. That when you read these things, that the evidence for it is beyond question. And recently I had some dialogue with a cousin of mine who is very, very heavily involved. I mean, he's got so much invested in the Bible students, and in particular the chronological elements of the Bible students, that there's when you've invested so much of your life into something, you're not going to be able to argue successfully with somebody like that, because they have so much invested in it, they were born into it. Not only born into it, but he's built a complete chronological system that is so complex and convoluted and complicated that he's not going to say that all those years, the 30 years that he put into studying the Bible, is all for naught. And so that's unfortunate, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why a lot of people, especially of my generation, are reluctant to give up their faith in the Bible, because not only were they born and raised in a particular religion, but they've got their whole life has been built around this religion. So it's really up to the younger generations to see the reasons and the rationality of science, and it's happening. I mean, the fastest growing segment of the society from an ideological point of view, let's say a religiously ideological point of view, are the nuns. Nuns meaning we have no particular religion, or atheism, which is not a religion, but it is the lack of belief in God, and hence a religion. So it is happening. It is growing. It's funny. My wife and I, we watch Star Trek, and it was really, really, really funny because if you look at the episode called "The Cage," where it's an early episode of Star Trek, and the Captain Pike, who's had this debilitating injury that leaves him totally incapacitated, and Spock hijacks performs mutiny and hijacks the Enterprise to take poor Captain Pike to this forbidden planet, and it's forbidden because of the race of people there is so elevated. But they can make Captain Pike think that he is back normal again, and in the show, one of the punishments that these superior brain, they have these giant heads that convolute when they think, and they punish Captain Pike for disobedience by putting him in the midst of all these flames, and then they take it away, and they said that they've read into his mind an archaic belief that once was held held by humankind in its primitive past. Yeah. The doctrine of hell. I loved it. Gene Roddenberry had it right. And it really it just put a poignant spin on religion. And there are people today who still believe that. There are people today who believe in a flat world. How can this be? I think we're at a crossroads, and I think we'll see if we are able to survive, if we don't destroy ourselves off the face of the earth with the nuclear weapons. We will see the marginalization of religion. We'll see how these ideas will be considered fables and archaic stories that people once believed, fairy tales. But let's keep our fingers crossed. Let's hope that rationality rules, that it will continue to dominate and grow, and that these silly notions, Christianity is dying hard. It's kicking and screaming all the way, and it's doing terrible things to try and brainwash their children to not accept science. But it is I'm sorry. But I guess my attention is needed elsewhere. So I'm going to say so long to everybody, and I hope this has been of some interest to you. And that's my dear wife. She played a huge role, believe it or not, in me beginning to question my faith. She never believed in religion, and that religion should dominate one's life to the extent that I was brainwashed to believe. And so she played a huge role in my eventual coming out of religion and becoming an atheist. So I have to give her a tremendous amount of credit for putting up with me, because it didn't happen easily, unfortunately. One thing I did want to say in this video before I go, the reason I take the moniker Truth Seeker, it's basically comes from the fact that Russell used, and in fact Jehovah's Witnesses use this today, as do Bible students, that they have the truth. We're in the truth. He went out of the truth. I went out of the truth. So they call their belief systems the truth. And that's the reason why I was able to look. I wanted to know what the truth really was, despite the degree to which I was indoctrinated as a child. Over time, I really wanted to know what was true, and that's why I use that name, Truth Seeker. And of course, I am an atheist, so Truth Seeker Atheist. But it's because of the fact that the Bible students claim to have the truth, and so I think it was only natural for me to use that as a channel name. So anyway, my wife, who put on a little puppet show for us, she says so long. I think she's riding a bicycle, and I say so long, and thank you for listening.